Chapter 1. Helen was sitting on the rooftop, with towering buildings beneath her. Angelica, I give you this body. Come out now. Standing on the edge of the rooftop, teetering, she was certain that Angelica would not let her die without help. She hadn't taken the medication prescribed by the doctor for a long time. All for today. Helen waited for a long time, and just when she was about to give up, Angelica finally appeared. Angelica is another personality hidden within Helen's body. Angelica answered in a lazy voice, "What? Are you willing to give up your beloved Charles Koo?" Helen looked into the distance, her tone unwavering. "Yes. I've let go." Memories sliced through Helen's mind like a knife. That day, she inexplicably opened the surveillance of Charles's lounge, only to witness a scene she never wanted to see in her life. The husband who professed his love for her was displaying a side of himself she had never seen before with the new intern in the lounge. Helen closed her eyes, unwilling to face it, but the sounds clearly reached her ears. "So, how about it, Kuzong? Compared to your partner, who do you find more irresistible?" Charles was venting with great effort, and after a long time, he finally squeezed out a few words. "Of course it's you." Helen's heart seemed to skip a beat. She was unwilling to look any longer. Glancing roughly at the snippets on her phone screen, in the past year, the two of them had cheated here dozens of times. As her thoughts settled, Helen spoke again. "In 7 days, this body will completely belong to you. The doctor has prescribed me medication, and as long as I take it, one of us will inevitably disappear. Angelica, are you listening? In 7 days, it will be her birthday, and also her death anniversary." As a child, Helen was gentle and introverted. When her classmates cut her braids, she didn't dare to tell the teacher, instead hiding in a corner and crying quietly. Classmates found Helen easy to bully, and they began a bullying campaign that lasted over a year. When her classmates locked her in a bathroom stall, Angelica appeared. She kicked open the bathroom door and went home. The next day, Angelica went to school and beat up all the classmates who bullied Helen. From that day on, no one dared to bully Helen again. Later, Angelica would appear during Helen's most painful moments. Helen took one last look at the sky on the rooftop, a tear rolling down the corner of her eye. This time, let Angelica permanently take her place. Chapter 2. When Helen returned home, she saw the slippers at the door and knew Charles was still not back. He used a business trip as an excuse to have the intern Selena accompany him on a week-long vacation. In Selena's moments, Helen had already seen it. Those heated, ambiguous, and unsightly images deeply stimulated Helen. Standing by the window, she could see the brilliant fireworks lighting up the Golden Hall in the distance, which was once the place where they got married. The fireworks in the entire sky almost illuminated the pitch-black night, and the last time she saw them was on their wedding anniversary. Charles once said, "My fireworks are only for you to bloom." Helen let out a cold laugh. His fireworks no longer bloomed just for her, because the order confirmation for the fireworks had just been sent to her phone, and she smiled. Signing her name without hesitation, Helen lay down in the guest room, her mind filled with memories of Charles from their youth since she learned of his betrayal. The two met in college, and Charles pursued Helen for 2 years, proposing 99 times, in order to give Helen a beautiful life. He founded the Koo Group. He once held Helen and said, "What others have, my Helen must have too. Everything, all of it, is for Helen." Once both of them had everything. However, Charles became restless. When Charles returned, Helen was already lying in bed. There was a noise outside the door, and Helen skillfully closed her eyes. The bedroom door was pushed open. Charles gently climbed onto the bed, watching Helen's faint breathing, and softly said, "Why did you sleep in the guest room again? Do you want me to stay here and sleep with you?" Helen did not open her eyes, only stating indifferently, "I have trouble sleeping. I just want some quiet." Charles gently placed a kiss on her cheek. "Then I won't disturb you. Good night, Helen." It was still that familiar scent of perfume. She had smelled this scent in Charles's office's hidden cubicle before. The next morning, Helen was awakened by Charles shaking her. Helen suddenly felt dizzy, nauseous, and the world was spinning. Just a second before she fainted, she fell into Charles's arms. "Helen, why are you so hot? Don't scare me." In a daze, Charles anxiously helped her put on her clothes, while the maid Lisa wanted to assist but was refused by him. He picked her up and ran to the hospital. "It's okay, Helen. We'll be at the hospital soon." The car arrived at the emergency entrance of the hospital, and before the door could even close, Charles rushed in with Helen directly into the emergency room. "Doctor, nurse, my wife has a high fever. Hurry!" A nurse recognized him at a glance. "Isn't this Mr. Koo from the Koo group? Come. Just put Miss Liu here." The doctor conducted a thorough examination on Helen, but it was just a fever caused by a bacterial infection. Charles was still so anxious, wearing slippers on his feet. Helen looked weakly at the exhausted man in front of her. If it weren't for knowing about his affair with the secretary, she would still be immersed in the illusion of a happy marriage that Charles had woven for her. The phone rang. It was a message from Selena. "Sister Liu, pretending to be sick is no fun. Do you believe that as long as I want, I can take him away from you at any time?" Helen glanced at Charles beside her. He seemed very tired. 2 fingers continuously pinched her brow. If it were in the past, Helen would have had 1,000% confidence that Charles would be by her side, because before, he had also rushed to the hospital with great fanfare. At that time, the company had encountered a particularly serious mistake, and he needed to return to take charge. He had stubbornly stayed until Helen's 4 was finished before hastily leaving. That time, the company lost over 10 million, but now, Helen is not sure. Chapter 3. His phone was turned upside down, vibrating slightly. Charles's phone screen protector had somehow turned into a privacy filter, and Helen could see nothing. Charles looked troubled. "Helen, the company has an urgent matter." Helen turned her face away, not looking at him. "You go ahead. I can manage by myself." Charles let out a sigh of relief and deeply kissed Helen on her forehead. "I'll take care of what I need to do and come back to be with you as soon as possible." Helen watched Charles's departing figure and softly said, "No need. The nurse next to me is still whispering and crazily gossiping. Look at Kuzong, so handsome and wealthy. Yeah, and he dotes on his wife so much. Just now he specifically reminded her to be gentle when giving her wife an injection, and he even covers Lou Miss's eyes while she gets the shot. Indeed, the best bride price for a man is a love-struck brain. It's killing me. Yes. Such a perfect husband. Who wouldn't like him? It's a pity that his acting is too good. His deep affection deceives everyone, yet he still can't control his lower body." But Helen was tired and no longer wanted to play along with him. Tears streamed down Helen's face. "Fine. Let it be this way," until the 4 drip beside her finished. Charles still hadn't shown up. The nurse pulled out the needle, leaving a long trail of blood. Bright red blood soaked the entire bandage, and the nurse quickly apologized. Even the head nurse came over. "I'm truly sorry, Ms. Liu. She's new and doesn't know better." Helen shook her head. "This little pain was nothing. It's okay." After saying that, she got up and walked out. This sentence sounded familiar. "Mrs. Koo, you are pressing the point." Helen ignored it, letting the blood flow down her hand. On Selena's second day as the executive assistant, she spilled tea on Helen's new dress. Selena had tears in her eyes, looking flustered like a little rabbit, a picture of pitifulness. "Helen, she is new here and doesn't understand. Don't hold it against her." "Sister Liu, you won't blame me, will you? How much is this dress? I'll pay you back." Charles naturally stood in front of Selena, helping her out of a difficult situation. "All right, you can go down now." Helen politely shook her head. At that time, she wasn't as openly provocative as she is now. It was Charles who gave her the confidence to provoke Helen. It seemed that from that day on, the scales had already tipped in favor of Selena. She should have noticed it earlier, Helen thought. If it were Angelica, what would she do? She would probably slap her across the face, and not only that, but also make Charles fire her. Sometimes, I really envy Angelica for being able to live so freely and boldly. But thankfully, that day is not far off. There are still 5 days left. After returning home, Helen burned all the photos of them together in the yard. The thick smoke attracted Lisa. "Madam, what are you burning? Do you need my help?" Helen smiled faintly, and as she smiled, she began to cry. She turned her head away and wiped the tears from her face. Seeing Helen not reply, Lisa walked away in disappointment, looking at the billowing thick smoke. Their past would also dissipate like these photos. In this world, there could no longer be Helen, nor anything related to Helen. As if she had never existed in this world, the suffocation in her heart seemed to ease a little. Chapter 4. Until the evening, when Charles returned, he brought back a limited edition bag with an orange logo. He walked up behind her and hugged her tightly. She explored her neck with her breath. Fortunately, no fever now. Helen, you scared me yesterday. I called you many times, but you didn't respond. You know, I can't live without you. As he spoke, his arms tightened around her. Can't I really live without him? Helen thought to herself, looking forward to 5 days later even more. Helen lowered her head, but saw a faint red mark on his exposed forearm. A wave of nausea hit her. She wanted to break free from his embrace but was pulled back by him. He thought that he must have upset her by not being with her at the hospital for the injection. His Helen had always had this childish temperament. They say that bags can cure all ailments. What do you think of this one? Helen glanced at the bag in front of her, its bright orange color clashing with her style. She had never owned such a vibrant and ostentatious bag. Seeing that her expression was not good, he still reached out to touch her forehead. Are you still feeling unwell? Should I go make you some congee? Yesterday, it was my fault for leaving you alone in the hospital. If you don't like this bag, what do you like? No matter how expensive or hard to find, I will buy it for you. Like, Helen responded faintly, but her expression was quite grim. Hearing Helen's response, Charles's anxious heart finally relaxed, and he pulled Helen deeply into his embrace. My Helen is the best. Charles was preparing to go to the shower, when he noticed the exquisite pill bottle on Helen's vanity, which contained only one pill. He instinctively picked it up and examined it closely. Helen, have you been feeling unwell lately? Helen turned around and saw the pill in his hand, her heart suddenly racing. She walked up to him, casually taking the medicine bottle from his hand and gripping it tightly. Smiling at him, it's nothing, just some medicine the doctor prescribed for me. It's for sleep, and it's quite expensive. Charles held Helen close, knowing that she often suffered from insomnia. How expensive? As long as it helps your condition, buy a whole box and keep it at home, so you can have it whenever you feel uncomfortable. Helen smiled. Who prepares that much medicine? All right, you go take a shower first. While Charles was taking a shower, Helen carefully hid the medicine bottle away. That night, Helen opened her moments and saw Selena's update. My husband's love is overflowing. The accompanying picture showed a floor full of designer bags. And in the corner, Helen also spotted one just like hers. Someone commented below, so many are limited editions. Selena's pride seemed to overflow from the screen. Yes, you need to buy a certain amount to get them, so I just picked 2 old styles. And what Helen held in her hands was the old style she mentioned for the purchase requirement. In the window of the picture, a familiar figure was reflected. That figure, she could never mistake. It's difficult for Charles to run both sides. He should really be called a master of time management. Turning off her phone, a sharp pain shot through her heart, and Helen fell to her knees. She looked up, realizing that when one is heartbroken, there truly is a feeling. Don't worry, there are only 4 days left. Chapter 5. The next day was the anniversary celebration of the Coup Company. Every year, Charles would take Helen to attend, and this time was no exception. He prepared a beautiful white dress for Helen, elegant and dignified, perfectly suited for her role as the president's wife. Helen, as usual, attended in full regalia, yet she could no longer muster a smile. She linked her arm with Charles and walked into the grand hall of the banquet. Reporters and the public relations department began taking photos. A stable marriage was Charles's best endorsement. The opening dance had always been Helen and Charles's. For this opening dance, Helen had practiced for a long time with a teacher, her feet thick with calluses, all to avoid embarrassing Charles. But unlike Selena, who came from a dance background, before they had even finished, Selena entered the dance floor with a partner, her eyes filled with pride. The melodious music suddenly transformed into a passionate Latin dance tune. Selena, in a striking red Latin dance dress, with her fiery red lips boldly displayed and her meticulously styled curls, showcased all her physical advantages to the fullest. In almost an instant, she captured everyone's gaze and attention. Her white, voluptuous chest trembled violently with the dance, while her slender waist swayed perfectly to the rhythm of the music, radiating charm. Who is this? The president and the president's wife haven't finished their opening dance yet, and they've rushed in. Aren't they afraid of losing their jobs? This is Kuzong's family. Otherwise, who would be so bold? No wonder. This is to provoke the rightful queen. The guests whispered among themselves, and it all reached Helen's ears. Charles thought he was hiding it well, but in reality, the whole company was laughing at him. The ambiguous interactions between her and her male dance partner deeply provoked Charles. Helen unconsciously glanced at Charles, whose gaze was fixed on the hand of the male partner around Selena's waist. The Adam's apple rolled up and down, the fingertips gripping the wine glass slightly pale. Helen knew that he was jealous. He was jealous of another woman. After the dance, Selena politely thanked everyone, and Charles put down the wine glass in his hand, turned to Helen and said, "Helen, I need to socialize a bit. Take care of yourself." Coo. Helen nodded. Watching Charles's eager departing figure, he walked to Selena's side, gave her a glance, but Selena did not respond. Seeing her ignore him like this, Charles could no longer contain the anger churning inside, glanced around, grabbed Selena's arm, and walked out of the banquet hall into the adjacent lounge. Helen thought about getting some fresh air on the balcony of the banquet hall. It made her feel suffocated, but as she passed by the lounge door, she heard a familiar voice. It was Charles and Selena. Chapter 6. Inside, the low growls of men and the proud gasps of women echoed back and forth. "Are you going to such great lengths just to make me jealous? Little vixen. Did I say that? You are not allowed to appear in front of Helen." Selena's voice was laced with teasing that made one blush and heart race. Coo. "Isn't it just because she misses you too much? But does this trick still work for you? I want you to know how I felt when you were holding that woman. I can only be 1,000 times more heartbroken than you. This is the last time." Helen covered her mouth to keep herself from crying out loud, but her face was warm, already streaming with tears. Her first reaction was to run away. She jogged to the balcony, and with a bang, the door slammed shut. At 10 p.m., the fireworks burst forth on time. The guests all gathered around, taking pictures of Helen and applauding. Perhaps everyone thought the tears on her face were from being moved. She is the president's wife, envied by all, and this sky full of fireworks is only blooming for her. But Charles was nowhere to be found. Only she knew that he was doing the most unspeakable things with another woman. Just as all the guests were whispering and curious about Charles's whereabouts, a burst of music sounded, and everyone's gaze shifted to the center of the dance floor. The spotlight is on Charles. How difficult it is for him to come over and play the passionate lover right after his affair. The spotlight follows him to Helen's side, where he kneels on one knee and presents a South African diamond the size of a pigeon egg. "Helen, thank you for your companionship all the way. Let me put the ring on you." Helen's hand was taken by him, and on her ring finger, he placed the enormous diamond ring, but she could clearly see the red marks left on his neck from their earlier passion, just below the collar of his shirt. "Wow, isn't that the one I saw at the auction a couple of days ago? There's only one in the whole world. I can't believe President Koo got it." Nearby, a lady began to exclaim, "I've never seen such a large diamond before. The president's wife is truly fortunate." It really is a blessing. As the banquet was nearing its end, Helen felt very tired and returned to the dressing room, only to find Selena had been waiting there for her. The door to the dressing room was ajar. Upon seeing Helen, Selena smiled, arms crossed, her red dance costume already torn and tattered, barely covering some key areas. The numerous red marks on her neck were a clear indication of how intense their earlier encounter had been. "I didn't expect you, Koo, to be so tolerant. If it were someone else, they would have come over to grab my hair and slap me, wouldn't they?" Selena proudly, mockingly, was showing off to Helen, her hand gently brushing her neck. tucking her hair behind her ear. The ring on her hand, identical to the one on Helen's ring finger, shone with a blinding light. She leaned in close to Helen's ear and whispered, "You're just a coward. I used to think Mrs. Koo was a charming and formidable character, but now it seems she is nothing more than a useless fool. Charles said that if it weren't for the fact that you are an orphan, he would have divorced you long ago. Yet you still linger in Koo's house, refusing to leave." Helen had been enduring, her nails nearly digging into her palms until they bled. But in the next moment, control of her body was seized. Everyone watched in shock as she raised her hand and delivered a resounding slap to Selena. Chapter 7. Just now, Angelica struck too hard, causing Selena to stumble and crash heavily onto the nearby coffee table. The glass on the coffee table shattered everywhere. And at that moment, the doorway was crowded with people. Helen turned around and saw Charles standing outside with a large group of guests and reporters, all witnessing the scene. Selena. The surrounding crowd was abuzz with discussion. The president's wife usually appears gentle and soft, but when she strikes, she really shows no mercy. Look at that Helen assistant's face. It's all swollen from the slap. Charles rushed to Selena's side, crouching down to carefully check Selena's injuries. "Koo, help me, my stomach hurts so much." Selena looked very pained, holding her abdomen, while Charles looked up at Helen. "Helen Liu, what are you doing?" He had never called her by her full name before. As Charles picked up Selena and walked past Helen, he softly said to her, "Helen, I hardly recognize you anymore." He paused slightly, adjusted his emotions, and continued speaking, "I'll handle this first, and then I'll have the driver take you home." He was also blaming her. He felt it was Helen's fault. When facing someone who has destroyed her marriage, does she not even have the right to teach the other person a lesson? Gradually, everyone dispersed, leaving Helen alone in the empty room, staring at the shattered pieces of the coffee table on the floor. "Helen, I'm sorry. I just couldn't help it." The voice of Angelica echoed in my mind. Helen wiped the tears from her cheeks and shook her head. "I don't blame you, Angelica. You did what I've always wanted to do. But I still think of Koo. And actually Selena was right. I'm just a coward." The driver stood at the door, cautiously asking, "Madam, Koo always asks me to take you back." Helen shook her head. "You can go back first. I want to be alone for a while." The driver nodded slightly and retreated. The phone screen lit up again. Still Selena's message. "The child in my belly is destined for greatness. Room 203 at Sacred Heart Hospital. Do you want to come see the real Koo family?" Helen turned off her phone. She stared blankly out at the starry sky. Angelica couldn't help but speak up again. "Helen, don't tell me you're still planning to go? Why not go?" She raised her hand to check her phone and called a taxi. Before she left, she had to find out just how much deception and disguise remained. The city's nightlife washed away its splendor. It was already late at night, and there were very few pedestrians on the street. Suddenly, a flash of lightning struck outside. Helen shivered. It was late autumn. The weather was getting colder, and soon, the taxi stopped at the entrance of Sacred Heart Hospital. Following the information left by Selena, Helen arrived at the door of the ward. Through the ajar door, Helen saw Charles's mother and sister sitting on either side of Selena's bed, holding Selena's hand with concern. "Selly, you need to be careful in the future. Next time, keep your distance from Helen. What if my precious grandson gets hurt?" "Yeah, sister-in-law. I don't know if that Helen is doing it on purpose. She can't have children herself, yet she won't let you get pregnant." "Selly, sister-in-law?" Charles nudged Carolina Koo from behind. "Who are you calling sister-in-law? You only have Helen as your sister-in-law." Carolina stood up, arguing with her brother. "I don't care. Whoever gives birth to the first grandson of the Koo family is my sister-in-law. She has been married to you for so long and hasn't said anything about giving our Koo family a son or daughter. Do you know how much mom envies other people's children? There are many cases of unfilial behavior. Not having children is the most serious form of unfilial behavior. What do you understand?" Chapter 8. Carolina is 5 years younger than Charles. When Helen and Charles first started dating, she always followed them around excitedly. And back then, She always affectionately called Helen sister-in-law. Because of Angelica, Helen always wanted to have a sister and treated Carolina like her own younger sister, making sure she had the best of everything. Unexpectedly, Selena made her willingly call Selena sister-in-law. Is it just because she is carrying a child from the Coup family? She still thought that, at the very least, her mother-in-law and sister-in-law were on her side. Helen's health was not good. She had previously gone to the hospital for a checkup, and the doctor said that after becoming pregnant, the chances of complications were very high. But she was willing to try for Charles. But Charles held her hand firmly and said to her, "I don't want you to take risks just to have a child for me." For so many years, news from the Coup family has been coming in waves. At first, Charles would help her fend off the fire, but later on, it was all Helen who dealt with it. Now she feels like she is caught between a rock and a hard place. Coup mother interrupted Helen's thoughts. "Sully, you are the most obedient. This ancestral bracelet is for you. Once the child is born, you won't have to worry about the house or the car. This child will be the only heir of the Coup family." Helen's vision had long since blurred as she watched Coup mother place the bracelet on Selena's hand. She remembered this bracelet. During their wedding, Coup mother held her hand and said, "From now on, you are my daughter. When you have a child, this bracelet will be passed on to you. Now it seems that I have long been abandoned by them." Charles was pacing behind, not daring to speak again. What he was thinking was that once Selena gave birth to the child, he would give her some money to send her away, ensuring that Selena would never appear in front of Helen again. Then, he could bring the child home under the guise of adoption, thus resolving the conflict between Helen and the family. For so many years, his family had been urging him to have children, but he couldn't bear to let Helen take the risk, so he could only resort to this desperate measure. But he didn't realize that the cost of doing so was the permanent loss of Helen. Helen didn't want to listen anymore, turned around and left, disappearing into the empty corridor of the hospital. "No matter what you say, my wife will only be Helen." After saying that, he picked up the coat that was placed by the bed, preparing to go home. He had just left Helen alone in the hotel, without properly explaining things to her. He needed to think of a way. Coup mother and Carolina exchanged a glance, then turned to look at Selena. "Don't listen to him. You carry our Coup family's blood. In the end, he will have to marry you. Don't worry. Yeah, we all believe you are our family." Selena smiled, her heart already blooming with joy. She knew well that a child could not capture a man's heart, but could grasp his lifeline. With a little more effort, removing Helen and taking Coup Madam's position would be hers for the taking. Chapter 9. Helen walked dazedly down the street as a torrential rain poured down, soaking her from head to toe. Her clothes were already drenched, and she walked awkwardly in the rain, trying her best to digest everything she had just seen. But in her memories, the Coup family had always liked her. At the time of the wedding, knowing Helen was an orphan, Coup held her hand and said, "Good child. From now on you will treat the Coup family as your own family. We will all be your family from now on." Helen also tried her best to fulfill the duties of a daughter-in-law and a sister-in-law. Now it seems that Selena had long replaced her position, and they had even known about Selena's existence for a while. When she lost her value in childbirth, she had no status in the Coup family. This was also true in Charles's case. A black Maybach sped by, splashing water all over Helen. In the blur, Helen saw the familiar license plate 520HL. She finally couldn't suppress her emotions and cried out loud in the rain. Raindrops flowed down her cheeks. "Angelica, why? Why does my heart hurt so much? What did I do wrong? Why are they treating me like this?" Angelica was there, but she didn't speak. She didn't know how to comfort Helen, and she could clearly feel that heart-wrenching pain. Charles's car backed up and stopped beside Helen. He hurriedly got out of the car, wanting to help Helen with the umbrella. Looking at Helen, who was sobbing in the rain, his heart felt like it was breaking. Charles helped Helen up. "Wife, what's wrong with you? Why are you squatting here in the rain? You are already weak. What should I do if you get sick again?" The heavy rain washed over Helen's cheeks as she struggled to open her eyes and look at the man in front of her. But how could he, who already had a child with another woman, so shamelessly speak of love for her? Helen trembled, saying nothing. Then, he tightly held Helen in his arms. I know. I was too harsh when I spoke to you just now, wasn't I? I apologize to you. Will you forgive me? Forgive? It's impossible now. After returning home, Charles picked her up horizontally and carried her into the bathroom, set Helen's pajamas aside, adjusted the bathroom temperature, and prepared the bath water. Helen sat dazedly on the toilet, while Charles crouched down and carefully brushed aside her wet hair in front of her. Honey, did I make you angry by sending an employee to the hospital? Employee? Is that just an employee? I can explain. After all, there are so many reporters and guests present. This is the best crisis management. Otherwise, tomorrow Mrs. Koo will post the video of slapping the employee online, and the trouble won't just be for Koo, but for you as well. Koo doesn't matter. I'm afraid you will face online harassment. Charles held Helen in his arms, gently comforting her. Helen, how about I help you wash? Charles smirked, and only then did Helen react, shaking her head in refusal. Charles only felt that she was shy. All right, I won't tease you anymore. Then you should take a hot bath. Your husband is outside. Helen closed the door and looked at herself in the mirror. Angelica, I'm really so tired. Angelica still didn't say anything, and the person in the mirror started to laugh, although it looked a bit awkward. Helen knew that the inarticulate Angelica was trying hard to comfort her. After tidying everything up, Helen lay down on the bed. Charles leaned over to hold her, his nose against her ear, his neck entwined, his hands wandering over her body. Helen thought of the scenes in the lounge, and couldn't help but feel a chill in her eyes. Her heart and her stomach turned with disgust. I'm tired. Charles has always respected Helen. He never forced her when she was unwilling. He then stopped his movements, gently kissing her shoulder. All right, then I won't bother you anymore, dear. Holding Helen's hand tighter, he had a foreboding feeling, always sensing that Helen was drifting further away from him. Tomorrow is Helen's birthday. As long as he behaves well and makes Helen happy, that's all that matters. But he didn't know that tomorrow was also the day she decided to leave. Chapter 10. Helen's birthday party is held every year at different venues in the city, and this year is no exception. Charles rented the largest garden venue for a birthday party, making it more extravagant and grand than most weddings. Early on, Charles went to supervise the venue setup. This birthday party must not have any mishaps. Before leaving, Charles gave Helen a hug, saying, "Good wife, I've prepared the evening gown for you. It's in the cloakroom. The driver will come to pick you up. I can't wait to see you in the gown." Helen watched him leave as the door was heavily shut. Helen returned to the cloakroom, looking at the evening gown that Charles had prepared for her. That was a high-fashion piece from a renowned designer. He had prepared everything for himself, like a Barbie doll, never asking for her opinion. Back in the bedroom, she took out the red pill that Dr. Lin had given her. As long as you take this pill, only one of you and Angelica will survive. Dr. Lin's words echoed in her mind as Helen held the pill, sitting in front of the vanity mirror. Angelica appeared at the right moment. Helen, have you really thought this through? If you take it, you will never see Charles again. Helen smiled and said, Angelica, if only you had been born in your mother's womb, then I wouldn't have to come into this world, wouldn't have met Charles, and wouldn't have lost myself in love. But none of this is your fault. It's their problem. Helen was very determined, looking at Angelica in the mirror. If only I could touch you. I really want to hug you. Angelica looked very serious, but tears fell. How could she not feel heartache for her sister? She stroked her face. You think carefully. If I really occupy your body, you're Charles. I won't hold back. Why don't you give him a call again? Give him a chance? Helen let out a bitter laugh. She had given Charles too many chances already before she could refuse. A text from Selena caught her eye. Helen, since today is your birthday, keep 2 hours free tonight for Charles to spend with you. The rest of the time is mine. Did you see that, Angelica? What else do I have to cling to? Helen put away her phone and, without hesitation, opened the pill bottle and swallowed the pills directly. Helen only felt herself growing more drowsy. her body collapsing onto the bed as she fell into a deep sleep. A tear rolled down the corner of her eye. Charles. Never to be seen again. Chapter 11. Just as Charles was preparing for the surprise birthday party for Helen tonight, he was upstairs being intimate with Selena. Recently, Helen has become suspicious. You better behave yourself. If she discovers your existence, I've warned you about the consequences. Selena's index finger traced circles on his chest. If I wanted to discover it, I would have done so long ago. Charles, you still have to accompany her tonight. I don't ask for much. Just a little while, until your banquet starts. Selena's neckline was very low, and Charles's gaze lingered on her, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. She knew Charles couldn't resist her like this. After a release, Charles went to the shower to wash up. Selena unlocked his phone. Send a message to Helen and then delete it. I just heard a phone ringing. Who was it? Selena replied, just a spam call. Charles pinched her on the butt, laughing as he held her chin. Here's a card for you. Go pick a bag you like. In Charles's eyes, Selena was the easiest to deal with. Just give her money. But Selena's appetite had long been spoiled, and she had long since looked down on this. The banquet was held as scheduled, and everyone had already arrived, preparing in an orderly manner. Everyone is looking forward to what kind of birthday gift Koo will give Koo Madam tonight. After all, every year Charles prepares gifts for Helen that leave people in awe. Whether it's a diamond crown from the British royal family or a one-of-a-kind necklace worth a fortune at auction. Last year, he even gifted her a manor. The clock struck 8, but there was still no sign of Helen at the entrance. Guests were whispering and speculating whether Koo's actions were part of a play. Charles instructed his assistant to check if something had gone wrong, when suddenly a roar of motorcycle engines came from the entrance. Angelica appeared at the entrance of the banquet, not wearing the evening gown Charles had prepared for her, but instead a pair of black tight pants, black leather boots, paired with a black leather jacket. Charles had never seen such a Helen, including everyone present at the scene. Is this Mrs. Koo? Yes, you can't deny it. This kind of Mrs. Koo really has a unique charm. Even the host was rubbing his eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. As Angelica walked down the red carpet, only then did Charles see that it was his own Helen. A smile curved at the corners of his mouth. This kind of Helen was very different. Wife, happy. The birthday hadn't been spoken yet. Angelica raised her hand and slapped him. Chapter 12. Everyone looked at each other in confusion. What was going on here? Charles was stunned by the slap. Being humiliated like this in front of so many people was something that the usually gentle Helen would never do. Helen, what are you doing? There are so many people watching. Angelica smiled and pressed the remote control in her hand. In an instant, everyone's gaze shifted to the other side, and the venue erupted in chaos. Because on the big screen, there were Charles and Selena in a compromising position in the office cubicle. The crowd gasped, covering their mouths. Some blushed and dared not look, while others with ill intentions took out their phones to start recording, only to have them snatched away by security. She glanced around and saw Selena, dressed in an evening gown, standing among the crowd, equally shocked by the images on the big screen. If it weren't for Angelica already knowing, they would have planned to cheat right under her nose. Even her birthday party, they had to bring her along, didn't they? Angelica held the microphone in her hand and said to Selena, Miss Wen, would you like to explain how you ended up in bed with your boss? Everyone followed Angelica's gaze and found Selena in the crowd. Some people couldn't stand it, saying, so the homewrecker is here. Just look at her. You can tell she's not a good person. Koo is really outrageous, bringing the mistress to the lady's birthday party. Then, Angelica walked into the crowd, grabbed Selena's hair, and dragged her in front of Charles. Selena shrieked, awkwardly kneeling on the ground. Another slap. This time Angelica used all her strength. She had wanted to hit this woman for a long time. As she provoked Helen again and again, and as she bullied Helen, who was too soft-hearted to retaliate, there were continuous applause from the crowd. Kill her. The mistress deserves to die. Mrs. Koo, we support you. Charles's assistant shouted, turn it off. Where's the manager? Turn it off. Angelica looked at Charles's face. which was alternately red and pale, and felt a surge of satisfaction in her heart. Charles, our game has just begun. Selena covered her face, sitting on the ground sobbing, too afraid to make a sound, but Charles seemed oblivious, gripping Angelica's arm. Wife, let me explain. Angelica certainly did not want to hear his explanation, throwing all the evidence and the divorce agreement in Charles's face. Sign it. Charles carefully flipped through the documents that Angelica handed over, where the words divorce agreement were glaringly written in large letters. On the spot, he tore the document to shreds. Helen, I was wrong. I don't want to divorce you. Angelica smiled, her smile radiant. It's fine if you don't sign. We can go through legal procedures. After she finished speaking, she elegantly turned and left. By the time Charles chased her out, Angelica had already ridden away on her motorcycle. What happened that day almost became a topic of gossip among the upper class. Charles was utterly humiliated. The stock price of Coup plummeted, hitting the limit down for several consecutive days. The board was filled with complaints, and several partners called to say they wanted to cancel their collaborations. The image of the devoted husband that Charles had maintained collapsed in an instant. Selena also became the target of public criticism, and for several days she hardly dared to go out. She didn't know who had found her home address, but someone had painted red on her door, cursing her for ruining someone else's relationship and wishing her a miserable death. Every day, she lived in fear. Charles didn't understand why Helen's contrast was so stark. It wasn't until Angelica's lawyer found him that he learned Helen had already started the divorce proceedings. He returned home, wanting to ask Helen for clarification. In his memory, even if Helen knew she had cheated, she would never resort to such extreme revenge. She had always been a gentle and obedient woman. When had she ever spoken so harshly? No matter how hard he searched, there was no longer a trace of Helen in the villa. He called for Lisa but saw her wearing the scarf he had brought back from Italy last year for Helen. Chapter 13. Where is the lady? What's the story behind the scarf around your neck? Lisa stammered, nervously taking the scarf off her neck. A few days ago, I saw the lady burning photos in the yard. And yesterday, she gave me this scarf, saying she didn't want it anymore. Each of us received a gift from the lady, she said. What are you saying? Charles gripped his hand tightly. It turned out she had long been prepared to leave, waiting for this day. The lady said that we have worked hard during this time. This is a reward for us. Why didn't the lady report this unusual behavior to me earlier? Lisa muttered to herself, I haven't seen you come back to stay either. Charles indeed had been coming back less and less frequently lately. Ever since Selena became pregnant, he had found many excuses to persuade Helen, and each time she readily agreed. It seems that at that moment, she was already prepared to take revenge on herself. Charles, the suffocating feeling deep inside him seemed to be drowning him. He pinched the bridge of his nose and waved his hand, signaling Lisa that she could leave. He searched their room thoroughly, barely finding any trace left by Helen. It was so clean that not even a single hair was left behind. Helen really didn't want him anymore. Not only that, his phone was about to explode with calls. The assistant called to report, Coup. We have already taken down the video from all platforms. But, before the assistant could finish speaking, Charles could no longer contain his anger. No matter what method you use, I don't want to hear or see anything about that video from that day again. And what are the PR and legal departments doing? If they can't even handle this little issue, you should pack your things and leave with them. Charles threw his phone, shattering it into pieces. Compared to being embarrassed in public, losing Helen was the thing he could least accept. Angelica is much more comfortable and at ease here. On the night of her birthday, she kicked open the door of Dr. Lynn's clinic. Why did you give Helen that medicine? Helen is dead. She will never come back to life, right? Lynn, the doctor, is called Jeremy Lynn. He had long known she would come. He was not surprised by her actions today, but rather had been looking forward to her arrival. He just looked at her, whom he thought about day and night. Is it wrong to fall in love with a flawed personality? Watching Helen continuously suffer in her choices to help Angelica awaken. Is it wrong to fulfill everyone? Angelica grabbed Jeremy by the collar, her eyes wide with anger. I'm asking you a question. Answer me. Jeremy adjusted his glasses and lowered her hand. Isn't Helen in pain? Do you really not want to live once? This question left Angelica stunned. She had once thought that if she could completely control this body without having to share it with others, it would be great, but she loved Helen more. If her resurrection meant killing Helen, she would not be willing to do so. Jeremy wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her deeply. His kiss was passionate and aggressive, as if he had been waiting for this day for far too long. Angelica did not resist. She deeply knew that she also liked Jeremy. After all, she could not hide her affection in front of a psychologist. Angelica liquidated all of Charles's luxuries that were given to Helen, selected a large flat in the most expensive property in the city, added a lot of furniture according to Helen's taste and preferences, and went to the pet store to pick a white American short-hair kitten, named Coco. Angelica was curled up on the sofa, looking at the data on her iPad with a slight smile at the corner of her mouth. She was always keeping an eye on the public opinion trends regarding Koo and Selena. No matter what kind of response policy the PR company came up with, she had a way to release another bombshell. Meanwhile, in the living room, Jeremy was smiling as he watched the utterly focused Angelica on the sofa. He knew that such days would not last long. Therefore, he cherished every moment with Angelica. Chapter 14. The negative public opinion over the past few days had plunged Koo into an unprecedented crisis. Koo Zone. There are no records of the lady's entry or exit. Instead, we found a lot of transaction records. Charles' eyes suddenly lit up. What did she buy? Not only buying, but also selling. The lady has dealt with many of the gifts you previously gave her, almost all of which were sold online. And with the money she made, she acquired several properties. There are residential ones and commercial ones. Charles thought to himself, this doesn't seem like something Helen would do. In his impression of Helen, she had very low material desires and no particular yearning for money. No matter how expensive the jewelry is, it cannot win her favor. Even a bowl of porridge he personally cooked for her is more likely to please her. But why is this? Why would she do such a thing? Hire a private detective. Continue the investigation, and be careful not to expose anything. Yes. As if recalling something, Charles quickly drove home. He rushed into the bedroom, trying to find the bottle of pills he had seen earlier. His intuition told him that the pill was not ordinary, but after turning the bedroom upside down, he still couldn't find the bottle containing the pills. Lisa. What's wrong, sir? Did you notice the medicine on the lady's vanity while you were cleaning the room? There's only one in the transparent bottle, and it's red. Lisa thought carefully. Yes, that's the medicine the doctor prescribed for the lady after her psychological consultation. Psychological consultation? Yes. The lady often suffers from insomnia. After going to the hospital, the doctor said it might be a psychological issue. She then went to a psychological clinic, where the doctor said she was anxious and depressed and needed to take medication regularly. However, that exquisite little bottle, it was the first time I had seen it. Helen depressed? He never knew. Or perhaps he never cared. For a year, Helen has been troubled by insomnia, and he didn't even know. All he knew was that Helen often had trouble sleeping. Every time he woke up at night, he could see Helen sitting beside him. He only thought she was a light sleeper and never considered it further. Could this be the reason for her drastic change in personality? Do you have the address of that counseling office? Lisa thought for a moment. She didn't know. It was always Helen who told the driver the location. She only accompanied her and carried the bags. The driver knows that the lady always tells him the address. I'm terrible with directions. Before Lisa could finish speaking, Charles had already rushed out to find the driver and get in the car. Go to the psychological counseling office that the lady often visits. Angelica followed Jeremy to the counseling office. Bring Helen back to life. Do you hear me? Angelica slammed her hand on the table, while Jeremy looked at the documents in his hand, completely unfazed. He had expended so much effort to bring Angelica back. How could he easily give up? Since you can bring me back to life, you can also bring Helen back to life. I am willing to return this body to her. It was hers to begin with. Jeremy didn't look at her. He just said, so every time you call her in your mind, has she ever responded? Angelica was stunned in place. Indeed she hadn't. Before. Whether it was Angelica calling Helen or Helen calling Angelica, both of them would respond. In their minds, they could converse, could sense each other's emotions and pain, but she hadn't felt a trace of anything that didn't belong to her for a long time. As if she had been living in this body all along. As if Helen had never existed. Jeremy smiled gently, looking up at Angelica. This decision was Helen's own choice. I didn't force her. It was her own wish to not live anymore. Then, Jeremy walked up to Angelica and pulled her into his arms. I think Helen also hoped that you could live well in her place. When she came to see me for treatment, her depression was already quite severe. Letting her go might be a relief for her. Jeremy wiped away the tears from Angelica's eyes, cupping her face and leaning down to kiss her. Just then, the door was pushed open forcefully, and Charles's angry shout echoed in the ears of the two. Get the hell away from her! Chapter 15. Charles's gaze was like a sharp knife, as if it would pierce through the two of them at any moment. He clenched his jaw tightly, the muscles in his face twitching slightly, as if he were desperately suppressing the surging emotions within him. Anger and jealousy intertwined, and the repressed feelings of so many days seemed to find a breakthrough in an instant, ready to explode at any moment. Before Angelica and Jeremy could react, Charles had already rushed over, grabbing Jeremy by the collar and throwing a punch at his face. Jeremy painfully endured Charles's blows, one after another. Angelica tried to stop Charles, but he pushed her away. Charles, are you crazy? He was like a mad beast, pinning Jeremy down, almost hitting him mercilessly. Blood sprayed from Jeremy's nose and mouth, while Angelica held onto Charles's clothes tightly, pulling him off Jeremy, and then slapped him hard. Charles's eyes were bloodshot, looking at Angelica in disbelief. He finally stopped and looked at Angelica, his eyes filled with disbelief that seemed ready to burst forth. You hit me for someone like that? Angelica retorted coldly. You couldn't stand seeing us kiss. But did you ever think about me when you were having an affair with Selena? Charles's gaze dimmed, but the little remaining rationality still held onto Helen's arm. I haven't signed the divorce agreement yet. You are still my wife. Angelica ignored him, forcefully shaking off his hand, and bent down to help Jeremy, who was lying on the ground. When you were in bed with Selena, you didn't remember that I was your wife. Now that we have a child, shouldn't I thank you for making space for me? Watching Angelica carefully wipe the blood off Jeremy's face, Charles's anger surged to his head. Helen. Angelica turned to look at him, devoid of any emotion. Jeremy let out a small sound, and Angelica carefully examined his injuries. Charles clearly saw the worry in Angelica's eyes, a kind of concern that had previously only been directed at him. He couldn't help but want to pull Angelica over to his side. Angelica forcefully shook off his arm. Charles's hand tightened, blood dripping from his knuckles onto the floor. Not just from Jeremy's. The pain in his hand made him realize that he was also injured. Angelica immediately took out her phone and pressed the emergency call button. Hello. I want to report a crime. Someone here is causing trouble. Charles never thought Helen would call the police on him. A severe sense of losing control spread throughout his body. It felt like he was really going to lose Helen. Helen. I was wrong. I was momentarily blinded by desire and lust. What do you want me to do to earn your forgiveness? The furious beast suddenly resembled a wounded puppy, almost begging. Angelica forced a smile. Would it make Helen feel any better if she could see him like this now? Then, she composed herself and looked at him coldly. If I told you to die, would you die? Seeing Charles not speaking, she supported Jeremy. Charles, in my heart, you are nothing. Chapter 16. The police arrived quickly, and several people were taken to the police station. Not long after, Ku's mother hurriedly came in with Selena. My child! Charles. Ku's mother saw Angelica, who was sitting in the chair, walked over to her, and raised her hand as if to hit her, but it was caught in midair by Angelica and forcefully thrown aside. You cursed star! How could you send us Charles to the police station? You have a cruel heart. Angelica didn't want to pay her any attention, her gaze fierce. Say one more word, and don't blame me for being rude. Ku was frightened by this Helen. She had never seen this side of Helen. In her eyes, Helen had always been a gentle and obedient little rabbit, easy to handle. What happened today? Beside her, Selena also began her gossip. Lou's sister, if you have any anger, you can take it out on me. After all, Charles' brother is your husband, and if this matter gets out, it won't be good for any of us. Angelica only just noticed that there is another one here. Oh, so you do know it's my husband. Did you think about how it would affect his reputation when you were sleeping with him? In the police station, the sound of a pin dropping could be heard in the sudden silence. If it weren't for the inappropriate setting, Angelica would really want to slap him again. Selena was sobbing softly. Her mother protected her behind. Sully is carrying our family's child. You and Charles have been married for so many years and haven't said anything about giving our family a son or daughter. You should really think about where you went wrong. The police nearby could no longer bear to listen. Enough. This is the police station, not a place for your tantrums. Take your arguments home. Then, the police brought Charles out. The police asked Angelica, you can discuss it. If you reach a settlement, sign here, and the person can be taken back. If there is no reconciliation, detention is required for 7 to 15 days. Angelica slightly raised the corners of her mouth and glanced back at the two. She saw mother and Selena looking very grim. The words spoken in anger just moments ago felt like a slap across her face. Mother wanted to step forward to persuade, but couldn't utter a word. Charles glanced at Angelica. Since she could call the police, it was not impossible for them to lock him up now. Helen, there was a hint of pleading in Charles's eyes. He had never been this downcast in his life. Angelica helped Jeremy, who was sitting beside her, to his feet. You are the one who is hurt. You decide. Without a second thought, Jeremy directly told the police, no settlement. Angelica smiled. Just like her inner decision, she gently brushed Jeremy's cheek. Does it still hurt? This scene deeply pierced Charles's heart. His Helen really didn't want him anymore, even to the point of coldly sending him to prison. Selena plopped down on her knees in front of Angelica. Sister Lou, I beg you, let Charles go. I am still carrying Charles's child. Selena, shut up. Charles wanted to hide it, but he didn't know that Angelica already knew. Angelica forcefully pulled Selena's hand away. So what? Do you still want me to let him go because of the wild child in your belly? Put away your moral kidnapping. If you really care, you can go in and accompany him. After saying that, Angelica helped Jeremy and left without looking back. Chapter 17. Angelica brought Jeremy home and carefully applied medicine to his wounds with a cotton swab. I remember you are a champion in Sonda. A Charles is no match for you. Jeremy smiled, his wounds slightly torn, grimacing in pain. How did you know I was a Sonda champion? I saw it on the bookshelf in your office. Angelica is actually very smart, more rational than Helen, and has a good memory. Jeremy looked at Angelica like this and still found himself falling for her again and again. After all, losing someone else's wife does leave a sense of guilt deep down. Besides, if I don't get hurt a little, how would I know that someone cares for me this much? Angelica pressed the medicine onto the wound with a bit of force, making Jeremy's injury hurt even more. Old fox. Jeremy was still somewhat worried about Angelica's safety, saying, his emotions are out of control right now. You'd better keep your distance from him. Angelica remained expressionless, but the corners of her mouth lifted slightly. Don't worry. His thoughts should not be on me right now. Charles will soon receive the package sent by Angelica. Inside are plenty of Charles's infidelity evidence against Selena, as well as Selena's provocative messages to Helen, photos, and videos. Angelica organized everything for a whole night. Every time she saw those, her heart would still ache. Not out of jealousy, but out of hatred. She hated Helen for the grievances she had suffered without a place to vent, and she hated Charles for his heartlessness. 7 days later, Charles's hands trembled as he opened the package. He once thought he had hidden it well, having an affair with Selena right under Helen's nose. He was once very obsessed with the thrill brought by this behavior, but he never thought he would lose Helen because of it. The paper was crumpled in his hand. It turned out that Selena had provoked Helen long ago, trying every means to stimulate her, and Helen's depression was closely related to it. He clearly warned Selena. Charles drove to Selena's residence, which was originally meant for her to rest during pregnancy. Kicking open the door to the room, Charles gripped Selena's neck and pressed her hard against the wall. Selena's face turned red from being choked by him. Charles, you. Charles's hand showed no sign of loosening, his eyes swirling with immense anger. Have I ever told you? Don't let Helen know about our relationship. You sent her so many provocative messages in private. Who gave you the guts to do that? Selena, you're looking for death. Selena was almost suffocated, continuously hitting Charles's arm. Ku's mother and Carolina heard the commotion and hurried out, finally pulling the frenzied Charles away. What are you doing? Charles, let go. She's going to be choked to death by you. Selena weakly slid down the wall to the ground, coughing until tears and mucus flowed. She finally looked up at Charles while crying. Charles, when a person loves someone wholeheartedly, they will want to possess them. I am no exception. What's so good about Helen? Don't forget, she was the one who called the police to arrest you. I'm carrying your child. I want to give my child a complete family, not someone's illegitimate child. Is that wrong? Selena cried harder and harder, collapsing onto the ground. Charles looked at her coldly. I have always been Helen's one and only. What are you even worth to be compared with her? Seeing the two of them arguing fiercely, Carolina went forward to help Selena up. Brother, what are you doing? Don't forget she is pregnant. How can she handle this from you? Charles shouted at her with red eyes. You only have Helen as your sister-in-law. Ku's mother sat angrily on the sofa. Helen? Did she consider our Ku family when she sent you to the police station? Look at your pathetic appearance. Charles stepped back 2 paces, closed his eyes, and warned the three. You better behave. If I find out you go looking for Helen, don't blame me for freezing all your cards. I mean what I say. Chapter 18. Charles returned to the empty house, having dismissed all the servants, hiding alone in his bedroom, drinking box after box of wine. In his memories, there were only beautiful and happy moments with Helen. He could never understand why Helen could be so cruel. Suddenly, images of Helen kissing Jeremy would flash in his mind, her hand resting on Jeremy's neck, her eyes filled with love. The ground was littered with empty wine bottles. It was only when the assistant came to report to him that he found him lying among the wine bottles, covered in deep red wine and vomit. Only when he woke up in the hospital did the assistant step forward. Kuzong, the doctor said you can't drink like this anymore. Charles looked at the ceiling, feeling utterly despondent. So, tell me, is there any progress in the investigation? The assistant sighed, holding a folder, and continued, we found the lady's residence. It's an apartment in Repulse Bay. Charles got out of bed without a second thought, not even having time to change his clothes. Take me to find her. The assistant supported Charles, knowing he couldn't stop him. Charles was sitting in the car with his eyes closed, his face pale and terrifying, as waves of spasms in his stomach made him furrow his brow. The assistant looked at him through the rearview mirror and let out a deep sigh. All the way, he had been watching Mr. Ku and his wife come over. When he was with Selena, he knew there would definitely be an explosion, and he anticipated this day, but he had no way out. Downstairs, Charles saw Helen hugging Jeremy's neck through the floor-to-ceiling window, and the two looked very sweet together. Charles could no longer hold back, rushing upstairs and banging on the door forcefully. Helen, get out here. We're not divorced yet, and you're already flirting with someone else? Angelica and Jeremy were startled by the sudden shout in the room. Jeremy walked over, opened the door, and said, Mr. Ku, do you still miss the days of being detained? Charles stepped forward and grabbed Jeremy by the collar. Do you know she is a married woman? But he didn't expect to be pinned against the wall by Jeremy with a swift countermove. How would you know? What if you don't? Before criticizing others, take a look in the mirror and see what disgusting things you have done. Jeremy let go of Charles's hand, but the force didn't lessen, and Charles fell heavily to the ground. Angelica walked up to him and placed the divorce agreement beside him. You came at the right time. Just sign it. Charles no longer had the strength to stand up, turned his head away, and said fiercely, Impossible. Helen, I can't believe you could fall for someone else so quickly. Angelica struggled free, looked into Charles's eyes, and said word by word, Charles, I don't love you anymore. If you still care about what we had, just sign it. Charles didn't want to lose Helen, and was still trying to win her back. He called his assistant and said, transfer all my properties, stocks, and cash to my wife's name. After hanging up the phone, he looked hopefully at Angelica. I will give you everything I have. Let's not get divorced, okay? Give me a chance to change. Let's start over, okay? He had no choice now. He was willing to do anything Helen asked of him, except for divorce. Angelica smiled and said to Charles, impossible. I will never forgive you in this lifetime. Helen, Charles is confessing to you. Did you see it? Chapter 19. When the security guard asked Charles to step outside, it suddenly started pouring rain outside. Charles stood downstairs at Angelica's house, reluctant to leave. Angelica and Jeremy stood by the window, watching Charles getting drenched like a drowned rat below. Helen also broke down in such heavy rain. He should experience this feeling too. That day, Helen knelt in the rain and asked her what she had done wrong for him to treat her this way. How she wished she could hug her sister and tell her that she did nothing wrong. It was Charles who was at fault, and he would get his comeuppance. Now, Angelica has done it. However, compared to the pain Helen has suffered, this is still far from enough. Downstairs, Charles stands in the rain, as if this could wash away the pain deep in his heart. Before long, the raindrops hitting his head turned into a rhythmic sound on the umbrella. He thought Helen had finally softened her heart and was willing to forgive him. But when he looked up, the person who came was Jeremy. There were still bruises on his face from the beating Charles had given him 2 days ago. Mr. Koo, is it useful to demean yourself like this? Charles stubbornly looked at Jeremy, his eyes swirling with anger mixed with a hint of jealousy. This is a matter between us. It's not for an outsider like you to interfere. Jeremy ignored him, and Koo selfishly said, when she first came to see me, she was very ill. He was talking about Helen. At that time, her somatization was already very apparent. She not only had insomnia and depression but also suffered from headaches, limb paralysis, tinnitus, and slurred speech, among many other symptoms. Didn't you notice? Charles was taken aback. Helen had always been gentle and kind, and he had never paid attention to it. Or rather, his thoughts had never been on her. He only thought about making a lot of money for Helen, but what she wanted was never his money. Many times, she has shown signs of suicidal thoughts. Charles's hand tightened slightly, his nails digging into his palm, as if this was the only way to alleviate the numb, dull pain radiating from his heart. Jeremy didn't say anything more, just handed him the umbrella. Has Helen, who has always been by his side, really been in so much pain? The image of Helen and Jeremy kissing replayed in Charles's mind over and over again, until he watched the lights upstairs go out. Charles could no longer bear it and collapsed in the rain. Helen, was the previous you also in such pain? Angelica smiled at the transfer and agreement sent by her assistant. Things were progressing as she had hoped. Everything was going smoothly. The next day, there was no Charles in sight downstairs. He had been taken away by the ambulance, but Angelica didn't care much. All she thought about was taking revenge on Helen. Charles' properties had all been transferred to Helen's name, including the one that Selena was currently living in. Angelica arrived at Selena's residence with a group of workers. She gave a glance to the locksmith behind her, and the locksmith quickly opened the door in no time. Selena let out a startled cry when she saw who had barged in. Helen, how did you know I was here? Angelica walked into the living room, looking around at those seated on the sofa. Is there a problem with me reclaiming my house? What do you mean by your house? This place was Charles' gift to me. Selena couldn't believe it, pulling out her phone to call Charles, but he never answered. Selena paced back and forth in the hall, dialing the phone over and over. Angelica looked at Selena with a cold smile, saying, "It seems your Charles brother doesn't care about you anymore." Selena didn't stop her actions, still continuously making the phone call. Angelica shushed her and took out her phone, saying, "How about I make a call for you?" Chapter 20. Then, She dialed Charles's number and pressed the speakerphone. Almost instantly, the other side answered the call. Helen, you finally decided to contact me. Selena's face fell, but Angelica handed her the phone. Brother Charles, Sister Lou has brought a lot of people in and wants to kick me out. Please come save me. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Charles spoke up, directly extinguishing Selena's every hope. She has the final say. Brother Charles, you can't do this to me. What about the baby in my belly? Charles made his stance clear. I don't intend to keep this child, so you should find a time to deal with it. Angelica raised an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. She took the phone from Selena's hand. Helen, the person on the other end, wanted to say something, but she ruthlessly hung up, turning to look at Selena. Now, are you ready to give up? Selena's eyes were red. Helen, don't think you're anything special. You're just an unwanted orphan. Without Charles, you are nothing. Angelica ignored her and signaled the workers to start working. I don't want anything here. Move everything out. The workers began to move the furniture with the efficiency of ancient soldiers looting a house. There are still many things here that belong to me. You can't take them away. Angelica walked over to her, arms crossed. Your own things? Which of those on you was not bought with Charles's money? Even the outfit you are wearing right now. I demand you take it off and roll out of this house. You will obediently comply. Otherwise, I don't mind sending you in to stay for another 2 days. Selena, cradling her belly, perhaps still held the leverage of having a child in the eyes of Ku's family. But to Helen, she would only be a thorn in her side. Just as the room was nearly cleared, Ku's mother and Carolina arrived. Selena seemed to see a savior as she hid behind Ku's mother, who glared at her and seemed ready to strike, but was quelled by Angelica's fierce gaze. Helen, this is the house that Charles paid for Selena. You have no right to drive her out. Angelica slammed the transfer agreement down in front of Ku's mother. You see clearly, the owner of this house now is me. I have the right to handle everything in this house. Ku's mother looked on, her head nearly steaming with anger. Do you have no family manners? How can you speak to me like this? I am your elder. Elder? Once I divorce Charles. What kind of elder will you be? Seeing she couldn't win against Angelica, Ku's mother grabbed Selena's hand. Let's go. Let's go. If we can't provoke them, can't we at least avoid them? Exactly. Sister-in-law, let's go back to the villa. Can we really leave you with nowhere to stay? Angelica stopped the three of them. Oh right, the villa you live in is now mine too. Considering how much stuff you have, I'm giving you 3 days to move out. Ku's mother turned around in surprise. What? Charles gave you that villa too? Angelica smiled, to be precise. It's all the properties, cars, and stocks under his name. He cheated during the marriage and left with nothing. I think it's only fair for me to have these. Ku's mother, upon hearing this news, felt a rush of blood to her head and nearly fainted. You. Ku's mother tried to step forward again but was stopped by Carolina. Mom, let's go back and think of a solution. The most important thing right now is to protect Sister Win's baby. Ku's mother seemed to realize, yes, Sully, with me here, you can rest assured. I won't let our Ku family's child suffer even a little. Before leaving, she didn't forget to leave a harsh remark. Helen, you'd better not get too smug. I'll have Charles come over to deal with you. Angelica watched the three disappear from her sight and couldn't help but recall how Helen had once treated them as her own family. Now it seemed they were not worthy at all. Chapter 21. In the days that followed, Charles did not bother her, and Angelica felt quite at ease. Deep down, she had already calculated that she would make Jeremy bring Helen back, no matter what means it took or what price she had to pay. Everything she was doing now was paving the way for her future life. Angelica purchased 2 shops, one for herself, opening a flower shop, and the other for rent. Even if Helen wanted to take it easy in the future, she would still have an income. The style of the small shop was all arranged by Angelica and Jeremy themselves, almost entirely in the light purple that Helen liked. Every day, watching fresh flowers being packaged into beautiful bouquets made Angelica feel very healed. Jeremy, whenever he has time, will come to accompany her. They both cherish every moment they have together. Angelica went to take the driving test and bought Helen a car for transportation. It's not very expensive, but its safety features are among the best. Once, Helen mentioned to Charles that she wanted to learn to drive and get a license. But Charles disagreed. He thought driving was dangerous, and if Helen wanted to go out, he could provide her with a car and a driver. It seems like concern, but in reality, it is control. Helen, considering Charles's feelings, chose to be the obedient wife, complying with all his arrangements, but gradually lost herself. But she did not know that the steering wheel was steadier when held in her own hands. Angelica carefully selected a paper crane pendant, which she had sewn herself, and inside it was a peace charm she had prayed for Helen. She hung it in the car with great care, hoping it would protect her and keep her safe. Charles had indeed been quiet for a while. It was said that he had been in the hospital for a long time, having been in the intensive care unit multiple times. The next time she saw him was at the law firm where they were processing their divorce agreement. Charles still wore a suit like before, but he had become so haggard that she could hardly recognize the spirited man he once was. The lawyer handed the documents to the two of them, informing them that the divorce procedures had been completed. The assets had been divided clearly, and now only the signatures were left for them to successfully finalize the divorce. Looking at the once-spirited group president now in a state of despair, Angelica felt a pang in her heart. If it were Helen, she would have softened long ago. But she was not. The man in front of her, Charles, was merely the murderer of her sister. Seeing him like this only brought her a sense of relief. So next, Angelica was going to proceed to the next step. Charles had actually begun to suspect Angelica long ago. He had hired a private detective to investigate. The woman in front of him, Helen, looked exactly like Helen, but aside from that face, there was not a trace of Helen in her. He remembered that Helen had told him she actually had a twin sister who died in the womb and was never born. This time, coming to sign the divorce papers, was all to confirm his inner thoughts. Could it be that Helen's twin sister survived, and then came to impersonate Helen, deceiving him for money? Where did his Helen go? In the conference room, Charles and Angelica sat on opposite sides of the table, each lost in their own thoughts. The lawyer handed the documents to the two of them. Now, both of you just need to sign the divorce agreement to dissolve your marriage. Angelica swiftly signed the document, but Charles remained motionless. Angelica looked at him critically. Charles, there is no possibility for us. Whatever you do now, I will not turn back. Just give up. Charles, with a calm expression, leaned back in his chair and stared directly at Angelica. You are not Helen. Chapter 22. Angelica put down her pen, leaning back in her chair with composure, smiling at Charles. Even with doubts, she firmly believed he could not produce any evidence. Charles, stop making excuses. It's useless. Our marriage today is definitely over. Charles did not continue her words, coldly questioning. Tell me, where have you hidden Helen? He simply could not reconcile the aggressive person in front of him with the gentle and kind Helen he once knew. He couldn't believe that someone could change so drastically overnight. What do you want me to say? Prove that I am myself? Charles stopped. I don't believe Helen would do this to me, and I won't divorce her, no matter how much you try to cover it up. I will find the evidence to expose your true self. After speaking, Charles got up and left. Angelica put away the smile on her face and chased after him. She pulled Charles's arm to make him look directly at her. In the winter 14 years ago, I met you for the first time. You said I was the most special girl you had ever seen. The first gift you gave me was a teddy bear from the amusement park. You saved up for more than half a year just to celebrate my birthday. You said you liked to bite my face. You called it physiological affection. You said you wanted to give me a warm home. It was your lifelong goal. You still say that we should have 2 children. A boy who looks as handsome as you, and a girl who looks like me, beautiful and charming. Every word pinned Charles firmly in place. The memories they shared constantly provoked Charles, the one he vowed to cherish for a lifetime. Standing right in front of him, Charles's eyes gradually filled with blood and turned red, staring blankly at this familiar yet unfamiliar person before him, a tear rolling down his chin and falling to the ground. Even though he already knew the truth in his heart, he still refused to accept it. The person before him was truly his Helen, and he racked his brain trying to argue against it. These cannot prove that you are Helen. Perhaps she has told you about our matters. Don't waste your effort. After saying that, he pushed past Angelica and left in big strides. Charles, you bastard. Angelica didn't expect him to suddenly change his mind and not sign. This move by Charles completely disrupted her plans afterward. Twilight bar. Angelica drank one glass after another. All right, Angelica. It's just that the marriage didn't go through, right? Let's think of another way. Jeremy snatched the wine glass from Angelica's hand. I thought that once I got divorced, I could cut ties with him and never see him again. But why is it so difficult? Jeremy wrapped his arms around Angelica. He knew she was doing this to pave the way for Helen. As long as the marriage wasn't dissolved, she couldn't confirm Helen's safety. Not far away, a pair of eyes was staring intently at them. Charles clenched his fists, raising the glass to his lips and drinking it down. She was indeed not Helen. Helen is allergic to alcohol. Just a touch would make her feel unwell and break out in rashes. Previously, she mistakenly ate a piece of chocolate with alcohol, and Charles stayed with her in the hospital for 3 days of injections. But the woman in front of him showed no signs of any reaction. He kept rubbing his palms, trying to alleviate the numbness caused by extreme tension. If she is not Helen, then where did his Helen go? Charles gave a knowing glance to his assistant. Just out of the bar, Angelica and Jeremy were dragged into a van. Chapter 23. Angelica was already drunk, unable to walk steadily, while Jeremy was knocked unconscious and still in the back seat. When they opened their eyes again, they were in a secluded factory. Angelica had her mouth stuffed with cloth, unable to speak, while Jeremy was tied up by his hands on a beam, covered in injuries. Looking around, I saw Charles sitting quietly with his eyes closed. Are you awake? Angelica met Charles's cold gaze, sobbing and cursing, but it all turned into her powerless low growl. Charles walked over and lifted her chin. Are you hurt? You know, seeing Helen like this, it hurts me too. Charles removed the cloth from Angelica's mouth. Angelica shouted angrily. Charles, are you crazy? Do you know this is kidnapping? His grip grew tighter, and Angelica felt his hand trembling. Charles let out a light scoff. I'm crazy. Without Helen, how could I not be crazy? Tell me, where is my Helen? Where have you hidden her? Angelica had never seen Charles so furious, his eyes ablaze with anger, as if he would be consumed by it in the next moment. She underestimated his madness. If he weren't mad, how could he have established the Coup family in just a few short years? But she wasn't afraid. Angelica smirked. You want to find Helen? Charles was filled with hope. He wasn't wrong in thinking that she wasn't Helen, but in the next second, Angelica's words instantly shattered him. Helen is dead. She died while you were cheating, betraying, and spewing lies. You claimed to love her while seeking other women on the side. You even let another woman have your child. Do you know how she feels? I can. I have deeply and truly felt heartache, the kind that nearly suffocates. During the nights you were fooling around with Selena, she was alone, crying and trying to heal her wounds. Where were you then? Charles shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes before they fell. Angelica snorted. Who are you trying to act deep for now? Coup. Are you satisfied now? It was you who killed Helen with your own hands. Angelica's heart ached just as much. She was even more saddened by Helen's death than he was. Charles seemed to have gone mad, shaking his head and saying it was impossible. Helen loved me so much. How could she bear to leave me? No, Helen is not dead. You two must have hidden her. Charles gripped Angelica's neck tightly. Where is she? Angelica's face turned red from Charles's grip, but behind her, Jeremy spoke up. Let her go. I tell you Helen's whereabouts. Charles's gaze faltered slightly, and he loosened his grip, only then remembering that there was someone behind. Angelica kept coughing. Jeremy, you can't say that. Jeremy's eyes lifted slightly, filled with endless sorrow. Mr. Coup, have you heard of multiple personalities? Charles turned around to look at Jeremy. What do you mean? What stands before you now is Helen, but within this body resides another soul named Angelica. When Helen found me due to insomnia, I discovered that in her subconscious, there were two different personalities. The two sisters had a very good relationship. My sister never appeared when she was with you. However, recently, Helen found me and hoped I could help her disappear, returning her body to her sister. So, she is Angelica, not Helen. Helen's soul is already dead. Chapter 24. Charles laughed heartily, not believing a word that Jeremy said. But it seems that this is the only explanation that can make everything reasonable. If it is one body, then why does Helen have an allergy to alcohol while she is fine? Jeremy coughed twice. Put me down, and I'll tell you. Charles spat on the ground, feeling helpless. He was too eager to know Helen's whereabouts. The moment Jeremy's hand was released, he unexpectedly swung a punch at Charles's face. Having been suspended for a long time and with his arms lacking strength, this punch wasn't very heavy, yet Charles still felt as if he had been played. Grabbing him by the collar, Jeremy shoved him away, walked over to Angelica, and loosened the rope in her hands, saying as he did so, previous studies have shown that multiple personalities can have their own characteristics. Even allergens can differ, but the specific reasons for this still lack scientific basis. You just need to know that this matter is established. Not only allergens, but emotions can also be completely separated. Helen likes you. Angelica likes me. Two personalities, each possessing the other's memories, can feel each other's emotions. However, the patients with dissociative identity disorder I have encountered are almost all in a fierce struggle for control of the body. I have never seen sisters like them who want to support each other in my professional career. Jeremy carefully wiped away the tears on Angelica's face. Angelica held Jeremy close, feeling heartbroken and wanting to touch the wound on his forehead. There is simply no way for Charles to accept this explanation. He grabbed Jeremy's collar but was thrown to the ground by a shoulder throw from Jeremy. Then, as if nothing had happened, Jeremy continued to help Angelica up. If you were still a man, you could take me on one-on-one. You might not be my match. Let's go, Ange. The two of them supported each other as they left, leaving only their backs to Charles. Charles lay on the ground, unable to accept the fact that Helen had already left. That extreme despair seemed to swallow him whole. How could she bear to leave him? Charles walked aimlessly down the street, Angelica's words echoing in his mind. It was you who killed Helen. You claimed to love her while seeking other women on the side. You even let another woman have your child. Do you know how she feels? I can. I have deeply and truly felt heartache. The kind that nearly suffocates. In the countless nights you spent entwined with Selena, she cried alone, licking her wounds. Where were you then? Charles's eyes gradually turned cold. The instigator of all this, besides himself, was another person who had not faced retribution. Charles arrived at the place where Selena was temporarily staying. Previously, Ku's mother had sent him the address, urging him to spend more time with her. After the door opened, Selena was wearing a silk nightgown, her lower abdomen slightly bulging. Seeing Charles standing at the door, she rushed into his arms, crying and acting spoiled. I knew you wouldn't abandon me, Charles. Before Selena could finish her sentence, he pushed her into the room and closed the door. He tightly gripped Selena's neck and slapped her hard. Selena was frightened by his demeanor, retreating repeatedly on the floor. Charles, what's wrong with you? Charles remained silent, his eyes filled with murderous intent. Slaps and punches fell on Selena again and again, and then he grabbed Selena by the hair, dragging her to the shower, turning on the cold water, and locking her inside the shower. He remembered how his Helen had broken down in the rain like that. He also remembered Selena's provocative words to her. Since her birthday, Helen was no longer there. Instead, her sister took her place. But the previous Helen had no intention of hurting Selena when faced with Selena's provocations, even after being bullied to that extent. Now, he will return everything to her. Helen has suffered, and he wants Selena to suffer it all. Chapter 25. Selena clutched Charles's pant leg, begging humbly, Charles, I still have your child in my belly. For the sake of the child, please spare me. I know I was wrong. A child? How can a child compare to his Helen? Did I say for you to get rid of the child? Since you didn't listen, don't blame me for taking matters into my own hands. Selena was as wretched as a stray dog, kneeling on the ground, drenched. This is our child. How could I give him up? Even a tiger does not eat its cubs. Charles, please let me go. Can you let our child go? Charles stood still, looking at her coldly, until blood began to flow continuously from under her nightgown, and Selena panicked. Help me! I beg you! Charles stepped back with satisfaction and dialed his assistant's phone. Come over and handle this. The child cannot stay, as long as the adult survives. It's fine. In the following days, Charles locked himself in the study, constantly researching information about dissociative identity disorder. Finally, he found a way to resurrect Helen. There have been successful experimental cases abroad. Since Jeremy can bring Angelica back to life, he should also be able to bring Helen back. He couldn't wait for a moment, frantically searching for Jeremy's whereabouts. Until the end, the assistant said that Jeremy was last sent to the hospital by him and hasn't been discharged yet. Charles's heart seemed to skip a beat, filled with regret. He almost killed the only person who could save Helen. Before going to the hospital, the assistant prepared a fruit basket for him. After all, it is oneself who has a request of others, so one cannot go empty-handed. Charles held a fruit basket and walked outside the ward. Jeremy still had a bandage wrapped around his head, while Angelica was feeding him porridge. In Charles's mind, memories overlapped. Back in school, there was a little thug who wanted to bully Helen, which was a very cliché hero-saving-the-beauty scenario. Charles fought with a few thugs and ended up hospitalized. Before being hospitalized, he still remembered to wipe away Helen's tears. At that time, Helen was just like now, sitting in front of the hospital bed, carefully blowing on the porridge in the spoon, feeding it to him bite by bite. A dull pain radiated from her heart. And in the next moment, Charles adjusted his emotions and walked through the door. The two of them almost turned around at the same time. Angelica's smile froze, instinctively becoming somewhat defensive. What are you doing here? Jeremy tugged at Angelica's sleeve. Angelica, don't get agitated. Just sit down first. Charles's expression was not good, but he also remembered the purpose of his visit. Dr. Lin, I admit it was my fault before, and I can cover all your medical expenses. Jeremy and Angelica exchanged a glance. It seemed like Charles had become a different person today. Mr. Koo, what do you want? Just say it. Charles plopped down on his knees. Only you can bring Helen back to life. Please. No matter what you want, I can give it to you, as long as you can make Helen come back to life. I really can't live without her. Angelica's eyes were sore. If Helen could see him like this now, she wouldn't know whether to be happy or sad. Jeremy looked out the window, ignoring him. Although he had promised Angelica long ago to try to revive Helen, he still had no confidence. Moreover, his selfishness wanted Angelica to exist a little longer. Charles cannot be without Helen. So can he lose Angelica? For the first time in his life, Charles knelt down and pleaded with him. Lin, doctor, you should go back. I cannot agree to this matter. Charles anticipated Jeremy would say this, but he still wanted to give it a try. He placed his hopes on Angelica. Angelica, don't you want Helen to come back to life? After all, this body still belongs to Helen. I've checked the information, and Helen could possibly return. Chapter 26. Charles's eyes were filled with hope. He had always believed that Helen would come back. He knelt and moved closer to Angelica, noticing her hesitation, almost begging in a humble manner. You love Helen too, don't you? Angelica turned away. You have no right to mention her. Seeing that neither of them was willing to speak, Charles stood up and placed the divorce agreement and a blank check on the table. I've signed the divorce agreement. I just want Helen back. And you can fill in any number on the check. You don't need to rush to reply. I hope you can consider my suggestion carefully. Charles said nothing more and walked straight out of the hospital room. He was struggling to hold it together, his hands trembling slightly. He has offered all the conditions he could, just so that Helen can come back. He also understands that asking Dr. Lin to give up Angelica is like his inability to give up Helen, but he has no other way. He doesn't dare to use Helen to gamble. In the ward, Jeremy held Angelica's hand tightly. Neither of them was doing much better than Charles. Although they also wanted to resurrect Helen, it was not because of the conditions set by Charles. Jeremy choked on his words. At least he signed the divorce agreement. You and Helen are both free now. Angelica nodded. That's right. We will stick to the plan. After Jeremy was discharged from the hospital, Angelica inquired multiple times and finally found Selena's place. She also hired someone to follow Charles, keeping track of his every move. The place where Selena lived was an old residential building, and Angelica thought she had gone to the wrong place, confirming the address several times. In her impression, Selena was delicate and beautiful, and would never live in such a shabby place. Angelica covered her nose, feeling that the hallway was filled with the smell of pickled vegetables and sewage. Finally, at the end of the corridor, she found Selena's room. The door was ajar, and Angelica cautiously walked in. The room was damp, the windows blocked by the building in front. Not a single ray of sunlight could get in. Clutter was piled in the corners, and there were leftover takeout containers on the table, with Selena lying on the bed, her back to the door. You can just leave the takeout on the table. Seeing that the visitor did not respond, only then did Selena turn around, and when she recognized Angelica, she rolled back onto the bed. What? Are you here to laugh at me? Angelica sat on the sofa and asked softly. The child is gone. Are you happy? Before the words fell, Selena abruptly threw off the blanket and sat up, her face pale, glaring fiercely at Angelica. Angelica fiddled with her fingers. Not scared at all. It wasn't me who caused you to end up like this. Selena smiled, and as she smiled, she began to cry. I know. You want to say I brought this upon myself. Yes, I did bring it upon myself, but I still underestimated you. Mrs. Koo. Since I was little, my mom never liked me. Only my younger brother. She favored him in everything. I always thought that one day I would succeed, earn a lot of money, and then slap them in the face, making them realize that it's not just sons who can treat them well. Daughters can too. On my first day reporting to the company, I spotted you in the crowd at a glance. You were so dazzling and brilliant. How could someone be so good-looking in life? But why? When we are all human, do you have so much? So, I want to be with Koo all the time. I want to become Koo's wife. Selena's tears fell onto the quilt, drop by drop. Angelica only felt pity for her. I will climb up Charles, give him children, and one day, I will replace you in his heart. I will also become the object of envy for others. But I underestimated you. You seem delicate and weak, yet deep down, you are ruthless. Now, I have nothing left. It's all Charles. He personally killed his own child. He also caused me to never be able to be a mother in the future. Selena's hand kept touching her lower abdomen. She could already feel the presence of the child. Yet she still couldn't protect her. Chapter 27. Angelica looked at her like this and finally spoke. Why not call the police? Selena stubbornly wiped away the tears on her face. Charles was her first man. Despite how he treated her, she still couldn't bring herself to confront him. She was like Helen. No matter how much they were hurt, in the face of what they thought was love, they became the knives that others used to hurt themselves, leaving them scarred all over. Is it worth it for a man? Selena forced a bitter smile and turned to look at Angelica. Aren't you the same, Mrs. Koo? Didn't you just let me provoke you without retaliating before? Angelica looked at her as if she saw the stubborn Helen. So I retaliated. You have to love yourself first before others can love you. Selena had no way to refute that. She had thought about telling Charles, but she still held on to a glimmer of hope for him. What if one day, he remembers the good times and comes back to find her? Was it just for money? Not entirely. She had also invested her feelings, and she was serious about Charles. She had imagined countless times the happy picture of their family of 3. But now, everything is gone. Charles was arrested, and the informant was Selena. Angelica no longer cared about Selena, but she seemed to have come to terms with it. Having been around Charles for so long, Selena certainly knew that the money in Charles's hands was not clean. Not only that, she also went to the hospital to get her injuries checked. She accused Charles of maliciously injuring her, causing her to miscarry, and she received a substantial amount in compensation. She took the initiative to find Angelica, and the two arranged to meet at a cafe. Completely different from last time. The current Selena was already a normal girl, although she wasn't wearing makeup. It didn't detract from her natural beauty. Selena took a sip of coffee and said seriously to Angelica, "Sister Helen, I truly apologize for what I did before. I ruined your family. If it weren't for me, if it weren't for you, I would still be trapped in that hypocritical and disgusting marriage. Even if it weren't you, it would be someone else." A train derailing is never due to the scenery. Selena let out a laugh. Angelica asked her, "What are your plans for the future?" Selena smiled and looked at the sun outside the window. "I want to go back home, to live in a different city and start anew." The two exchanged a smile, as if all the past had scattered away with the wind. Angelica felt a warm sensation deep within her heart. If her life were only during the time that Helen wasn't here, she would still be content. In her next life, she wants to have a life of her own, and it will definitely be more vibrant and colorful. Jeremy has been spending a lot of time in the hospital lately, researching ways to bring Helen back. In fact, he is confident, but he is reluctant to let go of Angelica. This time, if Helen returns, it would mean that Angelica would completely disappear from this world. Every time he thinks of this, Jeremy's heart feels as if it has been cut by a knife. Charles doesn't want to lose Helen. How could he bear to send the one he loves away? But this is Angelica's wish. He has no other choice. In the end, Jeremy finally succeeded in his research. The medicine he developed, combined with electroconvulsive therapy, can bring Helen back to life. Chapter 28. The time is set for 3 days later. By then, Angelica will completely disappear from this world. Jeremy held Angelica, not wanting to miss a single second. "Jeremy, please do me one last favor. Can I erase all the memories of Charles about Helen?" Jeremy held Angelica's hand tighter. "Even now, you are still thinking about Helen." Angelica smiled. "I am thinking about you too. Find a good girl in the future. Get married, have children, and live a good life." Jeremy's tears rested on Angelica's cheek. In the dark night, the two embraced tightly. The day before Helen was to be returned, Angelica and Jeremy went to the prison to see Charles. She originally thought that she could clear all obstacles for Helen and ensure that she could live a stable life without being disturbed by the outside world. However, they did not see Charles. The prison guard told them that Charles had gone mad on the very day he was incarcerated. At times quiet and silent, at times raving and saying he was looking for someone, even banging his head against the wall, saying he deserved to die, and he has now been transferred to a mental hospital for confinement. Previously, the Koo family declared bankruptcy, and Koo's mother and Carolina seemed to have fallen from heaven into hell. Selling all their jewelry and designer bags was still not enough to pay off the debts, and they were chased by debt collectors every day. On that day, Angelica lay on the operating table, her hand gently brushing against Jeremy's face. "Jeremy, thank you." She knew that Jeremy's decision was not easy at all. If it were Charles, he definitely couldn't do it. Love is not possession, but fulfillment. Yet Charles has never understood this principle. Jeremy shook his head, but his eyes turned red. Watching Angelica take her medicine, Jeremy personally set up the equipment for Angelica. Despite his deep reluctance, he knew that Angelica's time had come. He retreated to the control room, placed his hand on the switch, and after a long while, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and pressed it. Angelica looked at the ceiling, slowly closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she still lacked the courage to say "I love you." She couldn't let herself become Jeremy's burden. Angelica had been in a coma, with Jeremy by her side, never leaving. This was the first time he had conducted such an experiment, and he wasn't completely confident. Finally, 3 days later, she woke up. Jeremy carefully walked to her side, filled with both anticipation and fear. The moment she spoke, All of Jeremy's hope shattered. Dr. Lin, how did I end up here? Helen has really come back. Helen had almost forgotten all about Angelica and Charles. Jeremy helped her find her way home. After completing this experiment, individuals will experience a period of memory confusion. Jeremy had promised Angelica to help her restore and piece together a complete picture of her life. Jeremy brought her back to Angelica's carefully arranged home. Helen felt both familiar and strange. She couldn't remember when she had bought such a house, where even the smallest corner was to her liking. Helen curiously asked, Dr. Lin, were we in a good relationship before? Jeremy smiled, we were sort of good friends. Helen nodded ambiguously. Her mind blanked out too much. She didn't know where to start, but subconsciously felt that not remembering was better for her. Jeremy took her to the basement, where she got into the car prepared for her by Angelica. Chapter 29. Angelica nervously sat in the driver's seat. Dr. Lin, you must be mistaken. I can't drive. Jeremy took out her driving license and permit from the drawer in front of the passenger seat and handed them to her. You forgot again. You can drive. And you drive quite well. Helen, although she forgot Angelica, the skills learned from Angelica would still be passed on to Helen, which is known as muscle memory. Helen touched the steering wheel, instinctively started the engine, and after getting used to it, excitedly shouted, Dr. Lin, I really can drive. Jeremy selected a destination in the car's navigation, Happiness Flower Shop. This road felt familiar, and Helen was driving smoothly, instinctively saying a few words. Indeed, the steering wheel should be held in one's own hands. This sentence sounds familiar. Jeremy heard Angelica say it before. In an instant, Jeremy's nose felt a painful sting. As he gazed out the window, his heart already stirred by tumultuous waves. Is his Angelica okay? The road was almost clear, and the two quickly arrived at the flower shop's entrance. Jeremy took a key out of the car and handed it to Helen. Helen covered her mouth in surprise. This flower shop, is it mine? Jeremy smiled and nodded. During the time I lost my memory, did I really accomplish so many impressive things? Jeremy watched her silently as she opened the door to the happy flower shop. Seeing Coco run out from inside, affectionately snuggling in Helen's arms. But not long after, Coco jumped down, and no matter how Helen coaxed, it just wouldn't come out. Jeremy's heart tightened. In this world, besides him, only Coco could distinguish between the two of them. Helen began her calm life, feeling fulfilled every day. She had checked her bank account, and the zeros behind were frighteningly many. She seemed to have everything, but always felt that something was missing. Helen put all her thoughts into the flower shop, and her busy days were quite fulfilling. That day, she received an order for a grand opening flower basket, and when she delivered it, the recipient recognized her at a glance. Mrs. Koo, what are you doing here? Helen waved her hand. You're mistaken. I am not Mrs. Koo. But the person kept pestering Helen, then handed her a photo of Helen Charles from his phone. How could I be mistaken? Mr. Koo, Charles. The girl in the photo did indeed look exactly like her, but the man next to her was someone she didn't recognize. Helen took the receipt from the guest's hand, politely said goodbye, and left as if fleeing. Charles. A sharp pain shot through her temples. Helen crouched on the ground for a while before she could return to normal. Back in the shop, sitting on the rocking chair in the flower shop, Coco unusually jumped up. Helen held Coco and fell into a deep sleep on the rocking chair. She had a dream, in which there was a person who looked exactly like her, and there was a man who always had his back to her. Every time she tried to see his face clearly, she would be awakened by a headache, as if some force was preventing her from probing. For the next month, Jeremy often came to the shop to visit Helen, and each time he came, he would tease Coco. He asked about Helen's recent situation and the daily happenings in the shop, saying that if she needed his help, she could contact him anytime. Before leaving, Helen wrapped him a bouquet of baby's breath. Jeremy accepted it and thought of Angelica. Baby's breath was Angelica's favorite flower. She once said that if she could be like baby's breath, it would be wonderful, as it has a long blooming period and is not easily withered. Jeremy controlled his emotions well and thanked her politely. Thank you, Helen. I will be leaving now. Call me if you need anything. Helen smiled, waving goodbye to Jeremy, her eyes welling up with tears. Goodbye, brother-in-law.